Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If, for some reason, the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill in our survey to be in with a chance of winning a £100 voucher for a Glasgow local business of your choice. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendays.org.uk/survey. Thanks to our supporters, the Arlington Bass Club, Glasgow City Council and the many more, which you can find out about on the partners page of our website. We hope you enjoy this event. Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival. My name's Stephen Sheriff. I am the festival coordinator. We've turned out with a gorgeous day for day 6 of the festival, and I've been to loads of incredible events already, so I would encourage you all to get out and to see some of the programme tomorrow. There's a whole host of buildings that you can get into without a booking, so I would encourage you to come down. On to today's event. Today's event is a Q&A, so we're really looking to get a conversation started here, so I would encourage you to share your cameras and your microphones, and we can get a chat going with Tony and Niall. Niall is one of the expert contributors in the film, and he's the Deputy Director at Glasgow City Heritage Trust and an architect. And Tony is the Executive Producer of the film and the Director of the Planning Exchange Foundation. I'm very, very glad to now hand over to Tony and Niall. Thank you.
Hello, great to be here and lovely to see so many people.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephen. And my cat has kindly joined us as well. This is wee Poppy, who's a little bit bored at the moment, so she's decided to take part too.
Could I start us off with a question to you, Niall? The film showed a lot of Alexander Thomson's buildings and talked a lot about him, but I'm really still appalled to find quite a few buildings of his in Glasgow in a neglected state. Why is this?
It's really complex, Tony. Unfortunately, it's all to do with styles of fashion, styles of economics as well, and in principle, what happened to Glasgow after the Second World War, and the whole idea of reimagining how the city was going to work from the Bruce Plan and the various iterations of that onwards. And the consequence of that was, there was this whole kind of rejection of the whole idea of Victoriana. And actually, when you look at the 1960s and some of the discussions that were going on at that time, and very, very interesting kind of consequences of that. I mean, there were things like originally they were moved to set up a kind of Victorian society in Glasgow, and it was the head of the council at the time, whose name escapes me, was horrified by the idea that Glasgow would be thought of as a Victorian city, which to us is just so kind of laughable when you kind of see all the great Victoriana in the city. So there was a whole kind of reaction against that, and the consequence of that was the New Glasgow Society was established as the New Glasgow Society rather than, anything that kind of pertaining to Glasgow's architectural heritage. So I think there was a backlash against it. And then there are other aspects too of types of accommodation within the city and what Thomson was trying to do in his buildings. And it's also to do with the business cycle as well, that businesses tend to want new buildings, and all to do with A-grade office space. And, as Thomson's buildings aged, they were not so attractive, and therefore they've gradually fallen out of use to the extent that, you get with the Egyptian halls, it's really the ground floor that's being in use, and it's the ground floor that is essentially the rents on the ground floor are paying for the rest of the building, which is lying vacant. And it's not just Thomson, obviously. You still get a lot of that in the city centre. And I remember doing a talk to the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on architecture and the built environment about this, way back in 2006. And I was pointing out at the time that there was as much kind of vacant upper floor space in Glasgow city centre as roughly, I think, 1.5 World Trade Centres. Which is a colossal amount of space that has to be kind of reused within the city. And hopefully, one of the things that the council wants to do about getting people to move back into the city centre, some of that floor space could be adapted into residential use in the same way that areas in New York like NoHo and Soho have been taken back into use. Hopefully that's something we can do to rectify that.
Oh, thanks. Okay, let's have some questions from...
I can see we've got a question in the chat here from Ewan. Good to see you, Ewan. Ewan gave us a fantastic talk earlier on in the week on William Leaper. Ewan, did you want to share your microphone and ask a question yourself? Or?
Yeah, sure. At one point in the film, I might have misunderstood this, but I think that Gavin Stout suggested that the iron and concrete buildings came after the red sandstone. And if he did say that, which I'm not 100% sure, that wouldn't be correct. It was against the clip of Gardeners in Jamaica Street, which is actually 1855, and the Cadoro in the Central Station of 1872. This almost ties in with what you've just been talking about, because what intrigued me when I started looking at the Glasgow buildings was we started out very bravely putting the steel and the glass there for everybody to see. And I think a newcomer to Glasgow would think, oh, these are very modern, these are the new buildings. And then the red sandstone came along. I'll throw in a couple of suggestions I've got as to why this might have happened. One was that it was certainly very clever marketing by the Locker Biggs quarry guys who persuaded all the architects at the time that red sandstone was the stuff, could be machined easily, nice soft material. Yep. But the other idea was, I think actually John Hume suggested this a few years ago, that he thought that after the bank had crashed the City of Glasgow bank crashed in 1878, everyone got a bit frightened of looking as if they weren't very permanent. And although these buildings have actually lasted probably better than some of the red sandstone ones, you might have thought they were a wee bit sort of temporary. And so they went for the sort of French Renaissance that I was talking about the other night, and the Sun Building and
fabulous building
revival, which is really the theme of it. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on that.
I don't, Tony, do you want me to have a go at that one?
No, I don't really have an answer. It's a very interesting point, though. I mean, naturally, people think the iron buildings are later, and it's good to point that out. And we perhaps should have tried to do that in the film. I'm sure Gavin knew that, but it perhaps gave a wrong impression.
I mean, there are multiple reasons for this. I mean, as you say, Ewan, the issue with red sandstone is it obviously did come later, so it ended up being again a fashion thing. That it was the quarry seams in Glasgow were all running out. So the yellow or blonde sandstone that gets used in Glasgow was becoming poorer and poorer quality. And so they were having to look further afield for sandstone. And that was when the railways were bringing it up from Mauchline and Lochabriggs, Ballycamal, all of these places, the quarries further south and kind of the south of Ayrshire and Dumfries, and bringing it up here. And it became a fashion thing. This was explained to me many years ago. And it was the thing like, if you lived in a red sandstone tenement, it was considered posher than a blonde tenement, because obviously it was a younger building and therefore it wasn't as old. And so it was obviously, it was more modern. But at the same time, there are other curious things going on. And it's funny, having come from Govanhill Bus this morning, we were having a whole debate about this at Govanhill Bus. Because Govanhill Bus obviously is built by Glasgow Corporation, and from the outside of the building, it looks very much like a traditional building. So it's an Edwardian Baroque building. It's in Ballycamal sandstone, so it's a nice red sandstone building with beautiful classical details on it. However, behind that veneer of stone, you have an incredibly modern building because it's ferroconcrete behind that. It's an early ferroconcrete structure. So it's actually intensely modern. And when you look into it and kind of Glasgow's history of concrete and ferroconcrete, and it's also affects Scotland as well, we're actually quite pioneering in all of those kind of techniques, but we end up cladding it in something else to make it look grander than it actually is. So you get that with Govanhill Bus. The roof at Kelvin Grove Art Galleries is actually ferroconcrete. So you know, it's quite interesting. It's like, you know, they have real modernity there. I mean, even and this surprised me, this was Dr. Nina Baker at a talk at the New Glasgow Society several years ago, kind of came out with this revelation, which was complete news to me, and is actually correct, that the tower for the city chambers is in fact concrete. So, and it's just clad in the stone. That's it. So it's in fact, it's a really modern structure. Yes. Fascinating stuff.
We noticed this. I mean, I did a certain amount when I was inside the Sun building, and I mean, I can absolutely assure you that the floors are concrete, and there's a lot of steel work.
There will be.
And the other thing that intrigued us was that it must be one of the first electric lifts in Europe. I think I'm right in saying the very first one in Glasgow was in Central Station. Or the Central Hotel or something like that. But the building I'm talking about is roughly about 1892, I think it started.
Yes.
The original machine, the original engine is still in the basement.
That's fascinating. Fascinating.
Never get out. But so it's a very, very modern building, but it's got a Francois Premier exterior on it. I just think it's crazy. Anyway, that's my point. So thanks very much for the answer. Thank you. Thanks.
That's okay. I think somebody was asking in the chat there, when did blonde sandstone become poor quality? I don't think it's so much it became poor quality. It was that the good seams were becoming more difficult to find. And so you do get that. I mean, funnily enough, and I won't name the tenement, I was up on the tenement a couple of weeks back, which has red sandstone frontage, but it was a mix of stones on the rear of the tenement, and quite a lot of it was blonde sandstone, and a lot of it was very friable, and that was 1904. So you have to watch out for things like that, because it's obviously coming from local quarries in Glasgow, and it's not particularly great quality. So you have to watch out for things like that, and obviously that happens a lot. You want to typically, and that was how architects thought at the time, you want to put your biggest bang in for your buck on the front part of the building where everybody is going to see it from the street.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Alexander Thomson, in one of his lectures, goes on about how poor quality the cutting of much of the stone was.
Yes.
So obviously there were problems at the time of workmanship or understanding how quarries worked, and he was very concerned about that.
It's true. I mean, I have to say from experience, and probably Thomson acolytes are not going to like me for this, some of this detailing is not particularly brilliant. So, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's kind of, I think Thomson's buildings are fantastic. It's just that, I mean, it's things like the pitches of the roofs are very, very shallow. Some of the parapet gutters are enormously big. And it's you just have to watch out for issues like that. And some of the stone that he does pick in various places. Some of it is excellent, but some of it is has not endured as well as it might. But I mean, there are reasons for that. I mean, you've got to remember that pollution in Glasgow was incredibly bad, worse than London's. And so you were getting a lot of these buildings were turning black really quickly because of all the pollutants in the air. And that obviously attacked the face of the stone. And then when we looked at it now, you also got to remember you've got to see it through the lens of the 1980s too. And when all of these kind of various pioneering techniques of stone cleaning were taking place, and some of the stone cleaning that was going on actually did an awful lot of damage to the matrix of the stone and stripped off that kind of outer protective crust on the stone and exposed the sandstone underneath. And that has led to a lot of our tenements having bad issues with their sandstone, where they're more friable sections of sandstone as a consequence of that. And also you get salts leaching out of the sandstone as well, which can discolor it in places. So you have to watch out for things like that too.
We have a question in the chat here from Gaia. 19 Gartuck Street restoration following purchase of all flats in the close is a success story of preserving a previously crumbling Alexander Thomson building. Seems that redevelopment for residential purpose is the way forward. What are the barriers to this?
Neil, do you?
Yeah, happy to have a go with that one. The barriers, I think, mainly are to do with the technical standards. The building standards that you would require to overhaul buildings like that, that's going to be your main problem issue. So it's things like to do with escape distances and making sure that you've got alternative means of escape, making sure the sand insulation is correct, that there are not fire issues between the buildings. So you're going to have to kind of be quite careful in how you adapt them. So that's going to be the main issue of how you go about doing that. And this, I mean, we've already been through this in Glasgow. Quite a lot of the buildings in the Merchant City. What happened with the Merchant City was it was one of the original comprehensive development areas in the 1960s and 70s. And that was because the area that was kind of covered by the Merchant City had actually been allocated to Strathclyde University for the expansion of the Strathclyde University campus. And when Strathclyde, having, the council was basically compulsory purchasing all of these various warehouse buildings to consolidate all of this for Strathclyde University. When Strathclyde University said, actually, we don't need this, the city was left with the problem of what to do with these buildings. And it was actually Alistair MacDonald, who is now the chair of Glasgow Building Preservation Trust, Glasgow City Heritage Trust, that came up with the idea that we should really be looking at what New York had done with its loft apartments in kind of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, where lots of artists were moving into them and kind of taking over these spaces and having these large loft apartments. Which was a really great idea for reusing these buildings. Unfortunately, what happened in Glasgow is it was a completely different market, and you got some of the very early conversions are kind of, they're quite intense, and some of the flats are quite small as a consequence. And it's funny, I had somebody earlier this year who was really wanted to move to Glasgow city centre and get that urban loft living experience, and was like, I'm really struggling to find a big loft in Glasgow city centre. Do you know of any? And it's like, no, I can think of about one or two. There are not that many as a consequence. So there's some very, very small flats in some of these buildings. And that actually now gives us a problem, because you can get, 20, 30, 40 people all having common ownership of various buildings, and then getting them to coordinate is it's herding cats. It's never straightforward and easy. So that's going to be a problem as well, looking at that. Does that help answer your question, Gaia?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that's a brilliant idea of, I love the thought of there being these New York style loft apartments in Glasgow. I hope that happens in the future. I can well imagine there'll be a market for that. Thank you.
Absolutely. I very much hope it does. I mean, I'm looking at streets like Union Street, and at the moment, Union Street, where obviously the Egyptian Halls is, Union Street is is a problem street because you get lots of diesel buses going down that street, and you get all the diesel particulate from the buses. Now, obviously, the council is trying to deal with that issue by turning the city centre into a low emissions zone. So what I hope is that, and it's happening already, that the various bus fleets from the various bus operators are turning into electrical buses instead. So you will no longer get that kind of heavy particulate coming out of them, and they should be quieter. And I hope that that will lead to kind of a transformation of Hope Street and also, Hope Street, Union Street, kind of Jamaica Street, those two corridors either side of Central Station, so that, you know, that people will actually see those as more interesting streets to live in, and that you wouldn't be affected by particulate and the pollution in the same way. Fingers crossed.
I saw a bus the other day with an advert on the back saying, "This is one of our new buses." And its claim to being new was it had Wi-Fi and internet connections. It didn't say anything about being electric or hydrogen powered. I think it's a disgrace that our main streets, that we live in a hilly city, our main streets are polluted by very heavy polluting buses. And I wrote about this, ages ago, and nothing seems to have been done. When I've just been to other cities like Lausanne, electric buses everywhere. Why is it that we are, I know you don't know, Neil, but why is it we're so slow in Glasgow at really being as innovative as our Victorian forefathers were?
It is quite depressing, isn't it? I think for me, another problem as well with the city, which is a consequence of all of this, is that we've had this kind of confused relationship with the Clyde. And this is kind of still a day, and that's one of the reasons why the Kingston Bridge is so high as it leaps over the river, is because there was this thinking that the upper harbour on the Clyde would still be in use. And obviously time's passed on, nobody's coming up the Clyde. All of the ships that are now coming into the river are huge containerized ships or big liners that can only go really as far as Greenock. And they can't come up the Clyde anymore. And I think we kind of have to accept that those days are gone. And, maybe we should look at kind of more of a kind of Chicago-like relationship towards the river, and that we should, rather than putting all our eggs in one basket and having this huge bridge at, the Kingston Bridge, we should have lower bridges that are slung across the Clyde at various points. And that would mean that there were alternative routes for the buses rather than everything being funneled down Hope and Union Streets. So, and that might make things, the air quality better. I mean, it's good that kind of we're getting electrical buses anyway, or eventually hydrogen buses, I presume. So we'll solve that problem. But it still means that there is congestion on those streets when you don't necessarily have to have it. You could spread it out a bit more and improve connectivity.
Can we talk a bit about neighborhoods? Because I was talking to somebody the other day who was talking about how wonderful it was to live in a small town. And when I sort of unpicked really what they were saying, what they liked about the small town was the feeling of a neighborhood. And I think I'm lucky, I live in the West End, but it's obviously a neighborhood, That's what I like about it. I can get everywhere within 5 to 10 minutes and get to a cinema, to a library, to shops, and to small shops and everything else, and lovely, beautiful architecture. And there are other neighborhoods in Glasgow. I think we've inherited those very much from Victorian and Edwardian thinking.
Yes.
And I think that's what makes a city livable. People don't really
absolutely
live in the whole city all the time, do they? They live in a neighborhood and then they make use of the city centre.
Yes. Yeah. They might go to key points within the city, like a once yearly visit to Kelvin Grove or something like that. But yeah, absolutely. It tends to be, you live in your neighborhood and then you occasionally move to the city center for work, or at least that was the pre-COVID pattern. And the post-COVID pattern seems to be as though it's going to be more of a sort of blended working relationships where you spend some days working from tasks that are more insular tasks from home, And other days when you need to do creative things, you can go into the office and have drop-in centres in the office in the city centre, and you can still have that buzz, which people value. And it's about getting the two of those. And yeah, absolutely, you're spot on. The way that the Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian city and interwar city operated was that it was all based on the idea of walkability and how far you could get within 5 to 10 minutes, and which makes for an ideal neighborhood size. And it means that Glasgow's got some really great neighborhoods in it. And I do find it kind of slightly sort of bemusing and amusing, the whole that suddenly all these politicians have leapt onto the idea of the 15 to 20 minute neighborhood, when you think, actually, we already have all that in Glasgow. Glasgow's problem is more about putting Humpty together again from what happened in the 1960s and 70s with the motorway going through, and then with the comprehensive development areas, and the kind of clearances out of the kind of really dirty Victorian industries, kind of creating this dereliction around the city centre. And the task for our and future generations is going to be, how do you bridge that gap and fill in those neighborhoods once more, and all these kind of great tenemental neighborhoods that disappeared.
Absolutely. There's a question, Neil, about Lion Chambers, a building I love to look at. Pat McDade says, when are we going to sort it, if ever? Can we do anything about Lion Chambers?
Good question.
History, doesn't it? It's interesting it being built in the first place. That linkage between professional work, lawyers, and things.
Yeah, it's an intriguing building from that point of view, and very much a hybrid, and also quite pioneering as well in terms of its construction techniques and using the Hennebeek concrete system within it. And the reason for that was because it sits in the garden plot of a Georgian tenement next door. So it was an incredibly tight site. And so that's why they had to use those techniques, and which were all kind of precast elsewhere, to put together in order to build it on such a tight site. So it's a really interesting building because those were really pioneering techniques in those days. And the problems with it, I was involved with Strathclyde University's Masters in Conservation course. The various students on that course have been looking at the Lion Chambers as one of their studies this year. So it's been really interesting to see them all work their way through what the problem issues are with it, and how you could look at and try and resolve some of those issues, and the kind of programs they've come forward for the reuse of that building. It is fixable still. It's not insurmountable. The problem is the conservation deficit is so great. So, you're talking, a couple of million just to fix the problems with that building before you actually get it fitted out and get a new use within it. So that's that's your problem that you have to deal with somehow. And the other thing that people seem to forget about is it's actually an extension to that Georgian tenement, which became a business chambers next door. So they're actually interlocked and interlinked. And yet the Lion Chambers is A-listed, and this Georgian tenement next door is actually C-listed. And yet the two actually, they belong to each other. And so you can't necessarily tease them apart. And the other thing, I don't know, maybe there is a solution where you can look at the tenement site, and if you could gain additional space on that site, that might help offset the conservation deficit for the Lion Chambers. The problem is, if you do that, you get something that's going to begin to challenge the Lion Chambers in terms of the townscape and looking up Hope Street, and you don't want to obscure views to the building. So that's going to be one of the challenges with that building. It is savable, but it's things like what Glasgow Building Preservation Trust did in the late 1990s by putting a cage around the building, which was a brilliant thing to do, because that basically it stops the parts falling off the building, the spalling bits of concrete falling off the building. And that has bought it. It was initially the idea was it was going to buy it a couple of extra years. It has bought it several decades of life so far. But at some point, we're going to have to bite the bullet and sort out that building. And it would be disastrous to lose, in the same way that it would be disastrous to lose the Egyptian holes for Glasgow. We have to figure out a way to save it. I'm just looking at Guy's next question, which is a very good one. And yes, this is to do with the flow of visual beauty of the city when traveling from north to south and vice versa is interrupted by the area under the motorway with many derelict spaces. Is there a plan for regeneration of Tradeston at all? That's a good question, Gaia. There was the Glasgow Institute of Architects in the early 2000s. They actually thought that Tradeston was going to be the next growth area for the city. And so they did actually come up with a master plan at that stage for Tradeston. I don't think it's ever been kind of followed through on. And at various points, things have stalled with Tradeston, where we have been kind of quite fortunate and lucky in some ways, though it could be a double-edged sword, is the huge Barclays development, which has appeared on the south side of the Clyde, which has been utterly transformational. When you come into Central on the train, I did this yesterday morning, the effect of those buildings is really quite something. It has basically allowed the city centre to leap across the other side of the river. So I suspect on the back of that, and suddenly getting 5,000 people moving into, what's effectively 3 big urban blocks on the south side of the river, that you will get new businesses being established in the streets around there, who will be catering to the new staff that are going into those buildings and the new residents for the private rental towers, the 2 18-story private rental towers that are going up. So I suspect you might get that. Where the big unknown is then what happens in the blocks further to the south of that. And there are things slightly, this is where my architectural historian's hat. There's a block directly to the south, which has this fantastic Elder and Cannon postmodernist warehouse on it, which is very much modelled on Terry Farrell's TVAM building down in London. And I love it, but it's totally out of fashion at the moment. And it's like a single story, cash and carry building. And it's the kind of thing I can see, when somebody's looking at that site compared to when there's an 18-story tower block next door. How long is that postmodernist building going to last for? Could it disappear? But the thing you want to do there is get a lot of the redundant Victorian warehouses back in use. And other key things, other key sites within that are going to be, there's a fantastic fire station, Edwardian fire station, which was designed by the city, the corporation architects department, which has really beautiful detailing on it, which is well worth a look at. And getting that back in use would be great to see. This is where my Glasgow City Heritage Trust hat, we've been also focusing on the block that is on Bridge Street, the corner of Bridge Street and Norfolk Street. We've not long finished a tenement there, and that was a James Miller tenement. And that had serious problems with it. The close in there, it's a really unusual building. And it's unusual for James Miller to be involved in something as humble as a tenement. But he does a brilliant tenement there on this really tight corner site, which we presume must have been for the publican who owned that site. And that was the Glaswegian pub, which must have been a good earner because it's got some really quirky, interesting details within that building. But the problem was the cupola on top of the close was collapsing and eventually had to be taken off, and so it was letting all this water into the close. And it's really unusual close because it's a circular close with a P-ended stair in it, which is one where the stone cantilevers out from the wall, and it was the water running down the inside of the close from this failing skylight was rusting a lot of the supports for that. And so the worry was that stair would end up collapsing and would mean that tenement was uninhabitable and would give us a major problem issue. And so it's taken a lot of time working with the various owners within the building. And New Gorbals Housing Association managed to buy a couple of flats in there as well. And that helps kind of, form a cohesive residents association within the building. To take forward the repair issues. So that was quite a challenging job, but it's been very well done. And it's great to see. It's such a fantastic tenement that, and obviously you can see it as all the trains from London come into the city, and it's a really good Glasgow style tenement. So it's been good to save that. But that particular block, as you head north from it, has a lot of problem buildings in it. So in particular, there's one quite tall one which has this fantastic Egyptian cornice on it, which is a 1920s beautiful warehouse building, which is not in a good way. That was the chateau, which was where Franz Ferdinand used to hang out and practice. So there are various chateaus around this, but that was one of them. And so it would be really good to save buildings like that. It's a really interesting block, that one. And I'm hoping that on the back of the uplift in values, which must be happening on the back of both the huge Barclays site and also the transformational regeneration area, which the council's focused on in Lauriston, and all the new developments that are gradually spreading north from that once the two meet, that area will see some real uplift, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Hey, before people go, I just wanted to say a bit about the film. I mean, the film, one of the main points of the film was to get people to appreciate more what they've got in the city,
yes,
why it's as it is. And we produced this map because quite a few people have said, how do I find where these buildings are and these sites? So we produced a map which goes into every DVD which is sold now, but I've also happy to make these available to anybody watching the film. It details where everything is, and it's in nice, simple form. So when, I believe, Stephen, you're going to write out to everybody or email everybody and tell them how they can get a copy of the map, and we'll be happy to let them have one and show to their friends, because it's very important people know where to go and look at things.
Absolutely.
Is that right, Stephen?
Yeah, Tony, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about where the project's going to go next. You know, what you didn't get to tell in the first part, and where you'd like the story you're going to tell.
Several people have said, you know, this film suddenly stops about 1920s. Why is that? Well, the obvious answer is you can only do so much in an hour, and there's tons more we could have done, as you can see from what Neil's been talking about. So the plan is to try and do a follow-on film, and we've given it the provisional title of Imagine a City, because following on from the 30s, there were at least three big attempts to imagine a new way of thinking about Glasgow. There was the Boost plan, the Corbusier type, radiant city, knock everything down that's Victorian and old and build a new wonderful city. There was the ultra-socialist sort of hard left idea from the housing department of getting everybody to live in public housing. And there was one year where only one private house was ever built in Britain's second largest city, as it was at the time, which is amazing. It's covering the city with tower blocks and public housing, and that sort of vision of the city and great motorways and expressways everywhere. And the third vision was really to, as Neil's been saying, you know, to try and go back to neighborhoods, Victorian idea, keep the Victorian Edwardian architecture and live in it. And to do that, one had to improve it. And that's been a great story too, and a great vision. And there's bits of all these three visions around all the time. And it's probably a time for a fourth vision. But that's going to be a film we hope to make, and we're trying to raise money for it. And there's a Just Giving site, which, Stephen, you might put in your note to people. So if people are interested in helping create the next film, which will be done through the charity of the Planning Exchange Foundation. So any donations get a 25% uplift through gift aid.
I can see there is another question in the chat, actually, from Brian. The old stables building in Pollock Park is lying derelict at the moment. Is there anything going to be done with it before it goes the way of many other great buildings in Glasgow?
I can answer this one. It's the provisional plan, and it's got a little bit to go with this, is it's going to be turned into a centre for the Clydesdale horse. So this is Janice Kirkpatrick of the great design agency Graven, So this is one of her kind of one of her babies that she's kind of wanting to lead onwards, and it's this idea that it could be a centre for the Clydesdale horse, and it could be a centre for reinvigorating one of the lost trades of Glasgow, which was leather, and relearning about leather techniques. That, you know, when you look at what the French have done with those kind of things, that it's a major added value product, and so it could be a potential center for looking at something like that, which I think would be extremely interesting. And it's a really important building within Pollock Estate, and we've already done Show Me Your Lodge. And because I live around the corner in Pollock Shields, I was walking through Pollock Shields the other day, and I have to say the borough looks absolutely amazing. I have my concern about the borough. But from the outside, it's just, they've done such a fantastic job. It's like a shiny new penny. And so it's, you know, the Pollock Stables is really the next big target. You know, what are we going to do about that, and how are we going to resolve those issues? Because it's a fantastic complex, and it's actually a really ancient complex. I don't know whether people are aware of just how ancient it is, but the fantastic kind of door case that you go through that forms the gate into that is actually the remains of, I think, a 15th century castle that the Maxwells eventually incorporated in it, because it's that estate has various castles that, you know, as the family moved and eventually got into Pollock House itself, there were other castles there beforehand that they lived in. So one of which is Hag's Castle, obviously, in Pollock Shields. So it's a really important building for the city, that one. And it's hydropowered as well. It's got a wee hydro plant as part of it. So it would be good from a sustainable point of view to get all that working again.
Are there any more questions for Tony or Neil? Please stick them in the chat. Is there anything else you wanted to share about the film, Tony?
You know, I think it's been great to have so many people come along and join in a chat on a busy and sunny Saturday.
I know,
afternoon.
it's glorious.
But I particularly like to thank Neil, because he was a great source of inspiration and expertise on making the film. And I hope he is willing to give me some help in thinking out how we make the next one.
Absolutely, Tony. And I'd also like to thank you as well, because, you know, this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for your vision in the first place, and your drive to kind of get it there. And it's fantastic that you've ended up winning all these awards for the film. And it's a great film.
Thank you.
I've just put that Just Giving link in the chat if anyone is interested in having a wee look at that. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you so much to Tony and Neil for being with us. This chat is going to be has been recorded, and we'll stick it up on the Doors Open Days website, so that if you know anyone that's interested in the subject, they can log on and check it out there. And as Tony said, I will be in touch with everyone by email to share the details of the map and some of the future plans for the film. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll just encourage you to get out tomorrow and see some of the last of Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival 2021. We do have a £100 gift voucher for a local Glasgow business of your choice up for grabs for someone who is going to fill in the survey, one lucky winner. So if you can log on to our website, you'll find that in the navigation under survey. And we'll finish up there. Thank you again to our panelists and for everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Stephen. Thank you for joining all this.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you now.